All right, let's dive into the first book of the Bible, Genesis, which I argue is the most important book of the Bible. In case we haven't met yet, I'm Alexis Wade, and I'm a theologian and a minister of over 20 years, and I teach the Bible through note-taking. So if that's something that's interesting to you, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future Bible study note-taking sessions. Okay, for this Bible study, I'm going to take one of my older notes that I did when I first started posting these on social media, and I'm going to expand on it and make it even deeper. So this is a deeper dive into my Genesis overview study notes. And so we're going to start off with beginning with the purpose of Genesis. Genesis explains who God is, who we are, what went wrong, and how God begins his rescue plan. See, this is incredibly important because sometimes when we look at books in the Bible, especially ones like Genesis, we kind of see the big story arc, like, oh, there's Abraham, there's Noah, there's Joseph. But really, everything of incredible importance is chapter 1, 2, and 3. And if you don't know 1 through 3, then you aren't going to understand the rest of the Bible. So again, the purpose is, who is God? So Genesis is revealing who God is. Genesis also is revealing who we are, the created, made by the Creator God. What went wrong? That's Genesis 3. And how God begins his rescue plan. So that's what we're going to do in this study. We're going to really explore God's rescue plan and, what went wrong and why there's a plan needed at all. In order to understand Genesis, you need to look at it through 2 major covenants. And the first one is where we're going to camp out first. And it's the Noeic covenant, like for Noah. And you find that in Genesis 9:11 through 12. So this is when the flood happens and that God will choose to work through a broken humanity for redemption instead of annihilation, of wiping out everyone. And before you get, jumpy and say, why would God even think of annihilation? Okay, so this is the flood and the covenant is like Genesis 6 through 9. Human wickedness fills the earth. Remember, the fall was 3. Okay, so this is Genesis 6. Human wickedness fills the earth. God judges through decreation. He floods the earth. Waters return. Yet, God preserves a remnant and makes the Noeic covenant to never again destroy all life by flood, stabilizing creation so redemption can unfold. And the sign of this covenant is a rainbow, and it shows God's mercy hanging over a still broken world. So the Noeic covenant directly goes with the first half of Genesis, which I call the Genesis divide. And the first half of Genesis is 1 through 11, which is primeval history, and it doesn't have a dating. We don't know when things happened, but it's 1 through 11, and it really points to God creating the world, sin entering the world, and the aftermath. The Noeic covenant is the beginning of God's restoration plan. Actually, the beginning really happens in the garden, but that's another video for another day. If we're looking at the timeline, the primeval history is 1 through 11, and chapters 1 through 2 is the creation and calling. God speaks and orders a good creation. Humans are made in his image to represent him, to rule, and to cultivate. So they have assignments and not to eat from that tree. That's 3 through 11. This is what happens in Genesis 3, the fracture and its spread. So the fall happens, Cain and Abel happen, the first murder, and the flood, and then Babel. Now, we'll get to Babel here in a minute because that's the turning point of Genesis, and it's from the switch from primeval history to patriarchal history. So let's just go over kind of the main points of this primeval history. God is the creator and deems what he creates as good. That's incredibly important. Humans are created in the image of God, Imago Dei. And I did a whole shorts on this and made a Bible study notes on Imago Dei, which is a theological term that is created in the image of God. Humans, Adam and Eve, now they mimicked God's creative act and deemed the forbidden fruit good to eat. So God said, do not eat. You can eat from any of the trees except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what happens here is when God creates the world, everything, after each day, he ends the day, he assesses the creation of that day and he deems it good. And at the very end of the whole creative process, he deems it very good. And then we see Eve in the garden, and she assesses the tree, the fruit from the tree was good, pleasing to eat. And she takes on God's role as a creator, which is a no-no. And this creates the fracture and what we know as the fall. She eats, they realize they're naked, they go and hide from God. God calls out, where are they? And then they're banished from the garden and they're on their own. But we know that they're really not, because God intervenes. And that's where we're going to move to, because God doesn't really leave them alone. The world gets broken and more wicked to the point to where God says, I'm going to wipe them out in the flood. He says that he'll never do that again, and he will work through broken humanity for redemption instead of annihilation. Which brings us to the second part of Genesis, and the second part of Genesis is the patriarchal history. And it starts with a man named Abram. Abram, we know as Abraham, and the Abrahamic covenant is what kind of changes everything. So in Babel, in Genesis 11, they decide that humanity coalesces, comes together, and decides that they are, just as good as God. And so they make this tower to reach the heavens, and God breaks up the tower, breaks up the people, and people are dispersed all over and speak in different languages now. From there is a switch, which I call the Genesis divide, which is where we were talking about universal humans in 1 through 11 to now a specific tribe, a specific people of God being the ones who carry forth the covenant so that eventually all peoples will be grafted in through Christ. That was always the plan. So the Abrahamic covenant is God promises land, offspring, and blessing. And this becomes the backbone of all of Scripture. See, when you don't understand that it all begins, God's people begins with Abraham and has a plan for redemption through Jesus, the rest of the Bible kind of doesn't make sense. Also, if you don't understand Genesis 3, it doesn't make sense. So it's incredibly important that going forward, especially with reading the rest of the scriptures, we understand that God is made a covenant with humanity. He's created a people that will eventually lead to all peoples being grafted in who follow Christ and accept Christ. So in the back half of Genesis 12 to 50, we have the story of Abraham from 12 to 25. We have Isaac 25 to 27, Jacob 27 to 36, and Joseph 37 to 50. Through Abraham's family, all families of the earth will be blessed. So Genesis, if you walk away with anything from this Bible study session, is Genesis is 2 halves, okay? Primeval history, 1 through 11, which is the creation and the fracture, the spread of evil. 12 to 50 is now the pieces coming together, how God is going to restore this world through a tribe. So that brings us to under the Genesis name card. And under the Genesis name card, I originally had just key people and key events. Since we had already talked about the people, I felt like it was more important to really go into the Genesis of key events. So that's what I'm going to do. And obviously the first one, and I'm going to reiterate because, that's how we learn. You're going to hear this again and again and again if you follow my teaching. Creation 1 through 2, God dwells with his creation. God speaks order out of chaos. He evaluates what he created as good. Then we immediately hit the wall, which is the fall. Chapter 3, the serpent offers the humans another way to live. Autonomy. To be like God instead of submissive to him. There are consequences of the fall. Humans are on their own now, away from God, their creator. Chapters 4 through 5 is the spread of sin. Cain kills his brother Abel. Violence and pride escalate. Genealogy shows sin is not a one-time event, that this is something that is part of the world. It runs through generations. Flood and covenant 6 through 9. Which is human wickedness fills the earth. God judges through decreation, yet God preserves a remnant and makes the Noeic covenant. We move to nations in Babel, which is chapter 11. Humans unite in pride at Babel to make a name for themselves. God scatters them and confuses the languages among the people. Abraham comes at the Genesis divide, 12 to 25. God calls Abram. This is so important, everybody. God calls Abram out of a pagan world and creates a new covenant and the beginning of his people. See, that's important because so often we think of God's calling these holy, special people, but God calls us all out of the brokenness, and we're all in this mess. And Abram, he starts his covenant, his people group with a pagan person out of a pagan world. It's so important. Next, we move to the sacrifice and offering of Isaac, which is 22, which so many people struggle with, but it's no different than a foreshadowing of what the Father will do to the Son. What will happen with Jesus on the cross. The cost, this is the cost of covenant faith. And this is why all peoples on the earth didn't follow into this, because it is immense submission to God to be part of his people. This begins a substitutionary sacrifice model from Passover to temple sacrifices to eventually the cross. Then we get to Joseph, 37 to 50. Joseph is betrayed by his family, enslaved, yet in every situation, God is with him. God raises him to power. Genesis ends with the covenant family in exile in a foreign land, carrying God's promise into the unknown. See, this all leads to there are no perfect humans. Even though God created us, created the first people, created everybody we see in his image, Jesus will be the true image bearer on earth who actually reflects God and his righteousness to the world. Okay, did I prove my case? Did I show you how important Genesis is in this abbreviated study? Obviously, we could go deeper and deeper and deeper into this, but I wanted to take it just a little step deeper into the pool of understanding the big picture of what's going on in Genesis, because we need to read Genesis like a roadmap for the rest of the Bible. It needs to be our working framework. Honestly, it needs to be our working framework every single day, because this is how we become disciples, that we understand that we have this innate desire to want to take from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil like Eve. We want to define what is good for ourselves instead of being submissive to God, the Creator, who defined what is good. This is the core problem of discipleship. And it's the core problem of humanity. It's what you and I face every single day, and why it's hard to abide in Jesus. So the more that you study Genesis, especially 1 through 11, and seeing that brokenness and how contagious and infectious it is, you get to understand God's mercy and his grace and his plan. You get to learn it so much deeper, and it will translate into your walk and your ability to abide in Jesus even more. I hope this was helpful for you. If it was, make sure you subscribe, like, and share this with someone who also could benefit from hearing this good news.